I think we're live now. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the series of talks, Future in Blockchain at Imperial College London, Faculty of Engineering. My name is Nemil, doctoral fellow at the Department of Design Engineering, and today we're hosted by Mana Lab and Near Foundation. For those of you who don't know, Mana Lab is our research group on future of work and blockchain at Dyson School of Design Engineering. Together with researchers at Imperial College and Mana Search, we'll be working on developing scientific research on how the blockchain technology will affect leadership, organizations, and the future of work. Today, we're going to have a guest lecture with Nemil Dalal, head of crypto at Coinbase. Nemil is an engineer trained at Stanford, a Y Combinator graduate, and a seasoned blockchain product executive who developed one of the earliest DeFi protocols. It is a pleasure to have you here at Imperial College, Nemil, and without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and I'm super excited to talk to the group here. Thank you for taking the time, and I'm excited to answer questions you have over the course of this discussion. Today, I'm going to talk through maybe a few sets of things. One is I want to talk a little bit about my background, how I got into crypto, just for folks who are interested themselves in thinking about what pathways are there to be able to get into the space. Another thing I would love to talk about is the reason why we need more designers and why we need more engineers in the space. I think this is really critical with a focus on Imperial College and their mission. And specifically, it's for allowing us to be able to expand the people who can access and use the powerful benefits that crypto offer. And then I'll leave some minutes at the end just to talk about if you want to do your own startup in crypto, how might you go about doing that? And I'm happy to chat. A lot of folks reach out, and I think it's a really exciting time in crypto. So super excited to talk about that as well. And I think we'll have 15 minutes at the end for any questions you have. So feel free to add them in the chat in the comments, and then I can refer to them as we near the end of the chat. So I want to get started, and just maybe a framing is that it is an exciting and interesting time in crypto, and that is both in the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. So on one side, you have tremendous amount of different usage and activity happening in the cryptocurrency industry. And for someone who's been in the space for 8 years and has seen the space develop over the last decade, this is amazing from where it was about a decade ago. And on the flip side is, candidly, we are also looking for things to figure out as an industry. For example, how do we think about things like risk and safety? And so, for example, there are projects like USDT and others, where there's a lot of regulatory interest, a lot of things that need to be figured out. There's also a lot of ongoing security hacks in crypto. And so again, what the high levels I'd say is that super exciting times, both in good ways and a lot of things that we need to figure out collectively as an industry together. And this is where a huge part of the role that you can play as a student. So just maybe grounding in Coinbase's mission is our mission is increasing economic freedom to the world. And you can take a look at our website, you can take a look at Wikipedia on economic freedom. Basically, it's a series of characteristics that generally lead to better outcomes for people and for organizations and for societies. And so that's exactly the goal, is that we see crypto as playing a really powerful role in that world. And I always like referring back to this slide because I was in Y Combinator in the same batch where our founders, Fred and Brian, started the company. And on the left-hand side was their first version of the app, a demo of Coinbase that they created in 2012. And the initial goal was an exchange to let people trade and hold Bitcoin. And you can see over the course of the last year, on the right-hand side is where we are, which is one of the top, at the time, the top traded crypto app, and app specifically in at least the US App Store. So it's a tremendous amount of change over the course of this decade. And these are just some stats that I took from last year, that basically we have more than 70 million accounts on our platform, hundreds of billions of crypto traded, tremendous amount of crypto held on our platform in custody, and at the time about 2,000 plus employees, and this has grown substantially since then. And we went public last year as well. And the thing I think I want to ground us in, and specifically as a student, I think what is really interesting to me when I was a student myself, is trying to understand, how do people get into this space? How do they see something early, and how do they then go about deciding to contribute? And so for kind of alluded to my story a little bit, but the idea is that I was in Y Combinator, saw this from afar, had my own startup. It didn't work out, but I found myself really intrigued by the Bitcoin white paper. And I think that maybe one headline message for the group is that as an engineer, what was really interesting to me was I wasn't looking at media headlines around how Bitcoin replaced the US dollar. I think there was a lot of discussions then at that, or how it would be a payment system that would replace Visa and other networks. Instead, I was just looking at the actual white paper and saying, this is cool. I'm not sure I agree with the use cases that people are talking about, at least at this time, But what I do get super excited about this idea of these smart contracts, this idea that you can put together certain code, you can write it out, and then it basically adjudicates a form of transaction. I'll talk through this a little bit later in a section on DeFi. But at a high level, they got me super, super excited at the time. So I started with this Bitcoin scripting language. And in 2015, Ethereum launched, got super excited about that. And basically the value proposition as I saw it at the time was Bitcoin was taking JavaScript, a really simple language that many, many programmers can write, and using that instead of this very complex Bitcoin scripting language, which for those who've ever done like hardware programming is a stack-based language, super low level, almost similar to assembly. And to me, that was just game changing. And so in 2016, I saw like different hacks that were going on, wrote a security guide for the space. A lot of folks at the time were trying to figure out, how do I write secure smart contracts? And how do I go about making sure that people can safely put their money in? And so this was really exciting in 2016, is that I, 2 years ago had very little blockchain knowledge, and suddenly 2 years later, was spending a lot of time going deep into the details of specifically how you build brand new Ethereum smart contracts. And then I created my own DeFi protocol. And the rabbit hole at Coinbase for me is basically maybe like three sets of projects that I've focused on. I initially joined to run USDC, which at the time was a $200 million US dollar backed stablecoin. Now it's, I think, $50 billion plus, and it's been a tremendous amount of growth. I think what I got really excited about at the time was this idea of taking the dollar, which I think is widely used. Again, all national currencies are widely used. And then taking some of the properties of the blockchain, the fact that it's global, it's accessible anywhere, and being able to marry those two together. And that was a really exciting thing. And then started working on some of our crypto infrastructure, which I'll talk about a little later in this talk. But things like letting people build a blockchain and then be able to integrate it everywhere in the space within Coinbase and elsewhere. And this was really exciting for me, was that as a developer myself, as an engineer myself, what was super exciting to me was this idea that we make it easier for developers to build great things in crypto and get it widely adopted. And then I also, one other area that's been really interesting to me for a long time has been, how do we sponsor and grow the space? And so crypto is an interesting space where there's some parts of it where there's tons of money and a lot of private capital to be able to do really interesting experiments. And there are other parts of crypto which are basically like a public good or open source. And specifically, I think Bitcoin is a really great example of that, is that Bitcoin did not have like a initial foundation, did not have initial capital to be able to create and continue building on the protocol. So in a lot of ways, the way it's funded is folks in the space who want to support the mission of Bitcoin, funding it and helping to grow it. And then this was another area that I helped boot up at Coinbase, was the ability for us to start giving grants to key parts of the community. And so the reason I want to maybe take one step back before I go deep into crypto has been that I want to share maybe just two broad lessons for the group here. One broad lesson is that DeFi is super complicated, and crypto in general is just very, very complicated. And there's a lot of perspectives where the goal here is to take this complexity to make it so simple that anyone can use. And absolutely. But if I look at the internet, I think the things that are interesting are, it's not like that stuff disappeared. It's still there. It's not in the foreground anymore, but all this complexity, in the case of the internet, DNS, FTP, SMTP, all these really low-level things that we need to make the internet function are required. But what we did an exceptional job of was abstracting that away. And as a result, if you're, I don't know, let's say hailing an Uber cab ride today, or sending an email, you often don't need to worry about any of these things. While in crypto, it's the exact opposite, which is that there's all this complexity. We're still figuring out exactly what we need. So some of the terms on the right, we actually haven't figured out the version of it for crypto, number one. And number two is that what we need to do is figure out exactly how do we hide some of that complexity. You don't need to know the details of internet to be able to hail an Uber. Same thing is to be able to use certain types of applications in crypto, like NFTs or others. You may not need to know what block time is and what how much finalization time is and what the different smart contract risks that you're having to confront are. And so that's why I think one core part of maybe my discussion for today is just to share with you is that I think this is why you'll have a big role to play if you decide to get into crypto, is that we need design thinkers. We need someone who thinks customer and user first and thinks about all the needs they have and thinks about how to abstract away so much complexity that is in this space. So that's maybe one headline message for the folks here in the audience. The second headline message that I just want to share is that I think a big part, and as I alluded to earlier, for me in the space was getting super, super into the weeds of the engineering of how Bitcoin was created, what smart contracts were, why they were interesting, why they were challenging to adopt at that time. And then using that to say that like there's something huge here. I can't articulate to where it's going to go, but I know there's something really, really big here. And I think the same thing I really encourage folks who are thinking about getting into crypto is that rather than reading headlines or reading a Twitter feed to figure out if this is an interesting area where you want to spend your time, I really encourage you to pick 1, 2, or 3 things that you're really interested in and spend time going really, really deep, ideally from a first principles approach. And so what I mean by that is, if you're an engineer, it might mean reading a white paper, it might mean reading a code base, it might mean reading pull requests as part of the thing, and then drawing your own public opinions of where you think it's going. And I think that really cuts through a lot of the noise in the space. The space is constantly, there's hype, there's different forms of headlines, and often I think they're not necessarily reflecting the reality of what's going on behind the scenes. And so again, this is why, like I think as an engineer, as a design engineer, as a designer, these are the things to cut through to then figure out is like, what do you think is interesting about this and how do you want to get involved? And so I'll echo these themes as I go through the rest of the talk, but just want to reiterate is this is, I think, a really core part of like the fact that we need really great design thinkers, we need great engineers in this space to help us build and go from a world where I think it's a really like early stage product that has a lot of work that needs to be done to make it widely available to the whole world. And lastly, just before I go further, as a public company, I just want to say that today's conversation is for informational purposes only, doesn't constitute legal or investment advice. This is on feedback from the legal team at Coinbase. So just wanted to share that before we go further. So I wanted to just use one example. I know some of you have varying levels of background in crypto. And so I want to go through just maybe one example in the case of decentralized finance and why I think crypto is so interesting. And I always like grounding this in the key value propositions for crypto. And so some of the things that I think are really critical that come to mind are, one is that crypto, unlike other sets of financial services, other sets of products, is an open access system. And what I mean by this is that very similar to the internet, if you compare, let's say, a media entity in the 1950s or 60s to the internet when it first started, the World Wide Web, you'd see one core difference was in the 1950s, like entities, you'd have to go talk to someone, convince them that your message was what's worth sharing. And then suddenly you would be able to allow to disseminate that message through the network. And I think that's very similar, for example, to our financial system today. You have to go get approval. Once you get that approval, you're allowed to engage in the system. But without that approval, you are not. And what the internet did was really turn that totally around and change it to a world where it was open access by default. And so an example like this is that rather than having to get a gatekeeper at a media organization, you could just go post on Facebook. And this is, I think, a similar type of value proposition crypto is offering relative to the system that came before. So in the traditional system, you might have that permission access. It's a huge, huge shift where we have open access by default. And again, I'm not going to elide the fact that there's tremendous amounts of trade-offs here. For example, in the case of Facebook, my sense is that the Me Too era is a function of like the power of social networks. And yet there's all these other things that we're grappling with as well, which is the fact that, for example, you have things like fake news. You have filter bubbles. You have all these other things that come from this technology. And I think in the same way, crypto will go through and is going through some of those same sets of things. And that's where, for example, Coinbase plays a big role in that we have trust and we have different types of diligence that we do, and we require to review our customers' details before offering them services. But I think at a default, this is just a very big mindset shift from what came before. So that's number one. Two is that it's global access. And so you can think about our systems before this as like relatively balkanized. You might have like media environments in certain countries. Internet made that global. And again, we can debate how global it made it. There's certain areas of the world that are like more closed off than other parts of the world, but much more global than the world that came before. And I think similarly, that's one of the things that we're seeing in crypto is that we're seeing a world where it's becoming more global than it used to be for the products that are offered on the blockchain. That's a huge shift, again, how we think about it. So it might mean that someone who is in the US has access to the same product as someone who is in India or in Australia or in other parts of the world. So I think those are two like foundational, I think, value propositions that I see with crypto. Other things that we can throw on top of that are composability. And so if you're an engineer, you probably, especially a software engineer, you probably know very clearly all the advantages of composability. Basically, the idea is that you don't have to build everything yourself. You can take other great things that people have built. You can build on top of it, very similar to Lego blocks. And that's what the blockchain allows us to do as well. Is there are all these things people are building, and we can build things on top of that. And we can leverage the fact that they've built those things. And I think this is really taking in software engineering, what we have is this very collaborative building process and applying it to crypto products. And so, for example, it might be financial services, it might be NFTs, it might be gaming. These are all areas where you can build composable products. And as I show in the next icon, it's basically like they're programmable. So I think this is another really interesting thing, which is that I always reflected when I was first starting in crypto was that I was not a Wall Street engineer. I didn't work at a bank. I didn't work at a major financial institution, but I could build stuff on the blockchain for specific use cases that someone there may never care about. And that is, again, the power when you combine this open access with programmability is that the whole world of developers are able to build things and they can come up with and address different problems that are out there. And they don't have to be affiliated with a small group and have a certain point of view or have certain goals in mind. And that's a really powerful thing about this. So taking that open access, adding the fact that it's programmable to it. And then the last thing I want to share is just this idea of rules that creators can't arbitrarily change, because this is a constant theme in crypto. And what I think is really interesting here is like the unique first value proposition of crypto, specifically Bitcoin. The biggest thing that it was able to come up with was this idea of credible digital scarcity. And what I mean by that is the ability to set, let's say 21 million is the max Bitcoin that can be created. And even if you're the creator of it, you cannot change that after the fact without a whole social process to get many other parties to agree to that change. And that took, let's say, centralized decision making. For example, central banks around the world do this, of how much currency to be printed, and suddenly made it something that was set in stone, and that you had to basically get a widespread acquiescence to if you wanted to change that. And that is the theme, not just in Bitcoin. Obviously, it's very core to this idea of commodities or currencies that have a certain set value, or sorry, set amount of tokens that are available. But I think it's a really powerful theme throughout crypto, and I'll talk through that in the context of DeFi in just a second. But I think this is another really powerful thing about crypto. Again, the reason I'm belaboring all these points or going through them one by one is to say, these are the initial building blocks for the types of products that will come from it. And if you ask me to predict, there's no way like I can predict the whole wide range of things that we're going to build as a result of these building blocks. But what I'll say is that putting these together in different ways, shapes, and forms is going to lead to a tremendous amount of innovation, tremendous amount of ideas that are going to be thrown against the wall and people are going to try. And I think over the course of the next decade, a tremendous amount of changes in the way that we transact, in the trade, in the way that we interact as well. So then what I wanted to do is just talk through a little bit of an example of like a traditional bank versus like a DeFi like lending protocol. And there's just a tremendous amount of differences in these products. And so the process for starting a bank might be a business plan and charter insurance, lots more, and then users deposit. A DeFi protocol is a very different process. And there basically what you're doing is you're hiring a few developers, you're working together, you're launching a smart contract, and then users can deposit with it. And again, I don't want to say that these things are the same. There's some similarities between them, but they're widely different in many other ways. But just the fact that their models are just so different for things that in some ways offer some similar levels of functionality. And so a simple example is this is a code I wrote, I think in 2016. And it was what I called a simple bank. And what I meant by simple bank was basically users could deposit and they could withdraw their funds. And the reason I want to just show this as an example is that in about 20, 25 lines of code here, what I've done is basically allow any user to be able to deposit funds and pull the money out in the future. And what's interesting is that even though I'm the creator of it, I cannot touch the money that you deposit into this app. And that's very different. So for example, the joke I often make is that if you take a real world example, let's say a shoebox, and I came to your house and said, hey, here's a shoebox. I want you to be able to put your money in and I'm happy to give it back to you when you want. Very few people would trust you, right? And this is actually makes a lot of sense, right? And this is why it's so critical to have regulation in that service. And yet, what's interesting is with this code, okay, this is not all crypto. There are a lot of other things that are have a lot more risks embedded in them. And this specific code, the general idea is that even though I created it, I don't have the ability to pull the funds out, which is very different from physical real world interaction where I do, right? If I take your money, I can actually touch it, change it, et cetera, et cetera. In this case, there's no backdoor functionality for me to be able to access your funds. And again, in some crypto protocols, there would be. But I think that's a really foundational change. Is that I go back to the value proposition that I had earlier, which is this rules that creators can't arbitrarily change. And that's exactly the sets of things that we're able to bake into code like this. So there's a huge potential here if done in the right way. Again, there's a lot of risks in crypto, but if done in the right way, there's huge potential from products like this in the space. And so example is like a traditional bank versus a DeFi lending protocol. The whole process is just really, really different. So you might have launch fees, you have a certain amount of time it takes to create it, you're starting capital, you have an addressable market that's a little bit different, you have different types of ways that you come to market, and then you have a whole different regulatory mechanism. So in the case of a banking system is legal. I think in DeFi lending protocols, at least today, it's blockchain rules. I think over time that there'll be other forms of regulation as well. But I think it's really interesting just to compare just how interesting this new model and having the ability for users to access other ways of accessing financing to this are. So that's just one example of potentially just how disruptive this product is going to be. And I think there's a lot of echoes of the internet where it's super disruptive, tremendous amount of opportunity for users, and also a lot of risks that come with it that we'll have to grapple with, together as an industry. And the next thing I just want to quickly just talk through is a little bit of like, I often get asked, like, what is a crypto team? So I work on a crypto team at Coinbase. And I often get asked, what does a crypto team at a crypto company do? And so I want to just like set some tone, like some background for like the types of things that like a team has to do to be able to enable an exchange to run that touches all this blockchain infrastructure that's out there. And so example here is that the crypto team started first with a single Bitcoin node. And the idea was that there were people on Coinbase who wanted to buy and sell Bitcoin. So they wanted to send and receive it into our infrastructure. If you're a market maker, you want to move it from one exchange to another exchange. So you start with a node, and the node basically gossips and transacts on the network. Here's all the things that are going on in the world, keeps track of, hey, this Bitcoin moved here, this Bitcoin moved here, lets you know what the balances of given address are, et cetera. You start building some like layers on top of it, like caching, so it's easy to be able to do that without having to look through the whole history of the blockchain and things like that. And over time, what we've done is we built out, basically this crypto layer into like multiple areas. So like one might be like this idea of asset addition, which is that we want millions of assets used by billions of people over time. And so, for example, this might mean interacting with all the different blockchain nodes that are out there, being able to make those easily accessible to different types of infrastructure that wants to dig into that. So for example, if you run an exchange, we have a Coinbase exchange, needs to know exactly like how many Bitcoin have been received or how many of X asset have been received, onto our platform, how many have been sent. And then some of the interesting things that this team has to go through are every day, because these are decentralized projects because they're almost community-led projects, what it means is that you have to be able to track what's going on in that industry, what's going on the project, make changes if changes are made. And so, for example, if there's an innovation picking on one like blockchain, for example, the Cosmos blockchain, and there's an upgrade that has to be done, how do we go about managing that? What are the changes to the infrastructure? What are the changes to the protocol to be able to manage that? Another really core part of crypto, and probably one of the ones that is the most critical for this to be able to function safely for users, is the wallets and cryptography underlying it. And so, for example, what you have to do for an exchange, for any type of wallet that's a custodial wallet where the keys are held, you basically have to make sure that's held securely. And so what I mean by this is that, let's say you want to receive some Bitcoin. The way you typically do that is you generate a private key, then you generate an address from that. And so anyone can send money to the address. And if you have the private key, you can unlock that and send that Bitcoin wherever you want. And so we have to do this on massive scale. There might be tens, hundreds of millions of different addresses that we have to generate. And we have to make sure that those are held safely. And so there are things like cold storage, where there's infrastructure that doesn't touch the internet at all. And the funds are held on keys that are generated there. Some portion of it is set aside, very similar to, let's say, a bank has a vault and a cashier's drawer. So like most of it's held in the vault, in this case, cold storage. And a portion of it is held in like our hot wallet. And that lets us be able to, if there's certain user demand on a given day, access that hot wallet, that cashier's drawer instead. And then anytime we need more, then you go to the vault, you pull funds out and do that. There are a whole host of different technologies we're looking at here to make this process better. And so, for example, that old process of cold storage, the vault and the hot wallet, one of the challenges with a process like that is that it takes a while to go to the vault, pull the money out, put it into the cashier's drawer. And so as a result, like we're exploring different technologies like something called multi-party compute, where you can basically make it significantly easier to be able to pull funds out of that cold storage, make it much faster. And so this is really critical because the first wave of crypto, people wanted to buy and sell crypto, but hold it. And that was it. They didn't need to earn yield on it. They didn't need to move it around on a regular basis, any of that other stuff. And that's really changing. The same way, for example, you might have pounds in a bank account or dollars in a bank account. You're not willing to just put it under your mattress. You actually want to do things with it. And that's a huge part of all the technology that we have to create to be able to enable our users to be able to do something like that. And our last part is that I alluded to this idea that the first wave of crypto is buying and holding crypto. This next wave of crypto is like people doing different things with it, right? And so one of the big things is earning yield, and often that's done through staking, which means that you're participating in these blockchain networks. And by participating, you're earning a portion of like rewards. So for example, I might put in 1 Ether, and every year I'm getting 5% of that 1 Ether, 0.05 Ether, in compensation for the support that I'm providing the network. And for example, finalizing and helping them make sure the transactions are valid on their network. And so this is something, for example, that we need to do is like, how do you take billions of dollars and how do you start scaling this? How do you start putting this into protocols in a way that is really focused on trust, making sure that the user's funds are never lost, and also doing that at massive scale. So this is just one example of something that's really exciting for us to do. Another area, for example, is layer 2. And so if any of you have ever used a decentralized finance application, a decentralized app like OpenSea or an NFT product, you obviously probably spent some time on a blockchain paying gas fees. So for example, on Ethereum, gas fees range on the order of $50 to $200. In the advantage of something like these layer 2 networks is that the fees are significantly lower. And they often use the layer 1 networks like Ethereum as a way in which to write transactions periodically, but only settle on a periodic basis rather than for every transaction. And so the way I liken this is that, let's say you have a bank account and you have your 2 banks, they're putting transactions back and forth with each other. Rather than like every individual transaction for $1 or $3, moving them back and forth dollars every time that happens. So what they're doing is they're pooling them all. They're saying, hey, at the end of the day or at the end of the week, we're going to take the net difference and settle with each other rather than settling every single transaction individually. And this is the power of this layer 2 is if you do that, the fees are significantly lower. And so users don't have to pay $50 or $100 or $200 to be able to do a transaction. It might be 10 cents or 50 cents or even less than that. So these are just some examples of the types of infrastructure that we need to be able to build at Coinbase to be able to support all these different things that people are trying to do in crypto. And it's really changing from the early years to this new world where the application is critical. People's ability to be able to move their funds around and access them and do different things with them is really critical compared to what it was before. So I want to share, I maybe talk for 10 more minutes, and I just want to share some reflections and then I'll want to open it up to questions. But I think one big really reflection is that the price of Bitcoin, price of crypto is one of the most powerful onboarding mechanisms in the history of technology. And so I often like to joke that these Bitcoin price cycles, these crypto price cycles, for example, I think like crypto is down, let's say 20 or 30% from the high that it was just a few weeks or a few months ago, is I think what I joke is that this is often what I call the Moore's law of crypto. And so for those who are aware of Moore's law, it's basically this foundational law for semiconductors where it says, how do transistor density, how does that increase? And it basically says, how much does computing power, essentially over time increase? And the joke I have is that Bitcoin price cycles are that for crypto. And what I mean by that is that when prices go up, tremendous amount of interest comes into the space. So you have talent coming in. So I remember starting in crypto when this was a kind of a backwards area, a lot of quote unquote weirdos that were interested in the space. You were either a libertarian, there's certain types of or gold bug or other things that I think people associated with this space. And what's been really interesting over the course of the last decade is that more and more different types of people are coming to the space, which I think is really powerful. because they all have different perspectives on what crypto could be good for and what could be used for. So that's one thing that happens in these really big up markets, is that talent comes in. Now there's capital, so people get really excited about the potential innovations here. Tons of money comes in through VC funds, through investors, etc. There's a tremendous amount of media interest that comes in as well in these up markets. So like you're reading about blockchain everywhere, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the folks today in our chat are here, partly because of all the hype that has been here as a result of crypto. And then there's also increasing interest from organizations. So like large financial institutions is a perfect example where I know a decade ago, this was kind of a laughing stock, the idea that this technology was interesting or that a bank or others would use it. And now it's actually, that narrative has changed pretty dramatically. I think regardless of what crypto prices do tomorrow, I think this is here to stay, is the amount of investment and interest that will come from these institutions and how they'll continue growing over time. So that's the great stuff. That's the up market. The down market, what's really interesting to me is that that's when a lot of the great, all these things catalyze together. Often prices drop, and this has happened multiple times in the course of Bitcoin's life, in the course of the crypto industry's life. And what happens is that people really focus on building certain things, and there's certain innovations that come out with of that group who came in with the capital that was available to them at the time. They started investing in different things, and they started planting different seeds. And some of these seeds, end up nowhere. They planted them. It's an idea. It's interesting, but actually doesn't end up going anywhere. And there are other seeds that are absolutely transformational, but then lead to the next bull market, the next level of investment in this space. And so I think for anyone who's even considering crypto, I think the joke I have is that there are people who've been through, there are two types of people who've been in crypto: people who've been through one cycle and people who've been through multiple cycles. And the idea is that if you've been through one cycle, or often less than a cycle, you only see one part of it. You might only see the up. Often is what happens if people come in, sometime during the up, get super excited, and then potentially get dejected as the prices come down. And then I think there are people who've been through multiple cycles that have seen this, and they realize this is just the nature of the landscape of this industry, and that there's a tremendous amount of basic investment being laid right now, and that whenever the next sets of investments start coming to fruition, there'll be a tremendous amount of investment and interest again, holistically in the space. So I think this is one thing I want to share, is that, as you look, for example, at headlines about whether crypto, is dead or not, I often paraphrase that Mark Twain quote, which is that, reports of my death have been exaggerated. I think same thing, reports of crypto's death have been exaggerated. And you can see that basically this is the form, the last 10 years has been a pretty consistent cycle in crypto. And so really where we are in our cycle is basically that tremendous amount of people coming to the space, tremendous amount of investment has been made in the space. And now we need to figure out what are the next sets of things so that we can drive real utility to users, not just the ability to buy and sell different tokens. I think another big thing and a headline message is that I think especially early on, we talked a lot about crypto as finance and specifically payments. So a common perspective I get from folks new to the space is that super excited about crypto. I think the thing it's going to solve is payments. And often they tell me a story of remittances and how it's really hard to send money from one country to another. And so crypto is going to solve that. And I think the thing I'd like to drive home is, personally, I think that payments is really exciting, but I think there's still a lot of room for improvement there. Not a lot of people have access to crypto apps to be able to do that. A lot of the currencies are currencies that are wildly volatile. And so as a result, it makes it challenging to be able to use it for payments. But I think the thing I like to really drive home is that crypto is significantly bigger, and that is the internet, I call it for ownership. It's basically like a ledger where, and what I mean by a ledger is that it's basically a list of addresses and what is owned by that address. And then the ability for that address to say, actually, I want to own this and I want to trade for this, all that other stuff. And that really is just a way of writing down ownership. So this decentralized way to write down ownership. And so as a result, I think it's much bigger than payments, much bigger than currencies. And often another attitude I often get is that the power of crypto is that it's going to take Wall Street, it's going to take the financial district, and it's going to replace that with these crypto architectures in the future. And if anything, I think that often those are the harder industries to go disrupt on day one. There's a tremendous amount of investment that's been made over many years in those spaces. The benefits of crypto for that space might be 2x, which is great. I mean, 2x is a lot, but to get over all the switching costs that are associated, tremendous amount of work to be able to do that. So 2x may not justify that level of investment. And so I think what's interesting is that it's not just currencies, it's not just finance. And that's where I'll give you an example is that where I get super excited is, let's say, for example, gaming. Gaming is a massive industry worldwide. It's actually a global industry. And their economy is directly built into games that people have. And so as a result, I think that there's a tremendous amount of interesting things that could go on between crypto and ownership and thinking about what does that mean for, let's say, the character you have in the game and what does it own and what can it do with the things that it owns as just one example, right? So often what I think the joke that often is about new spaces is that they're kind of schemorphic era. And I think Chris Dixon at A16Z often makes this point is that you think about when something new comes, it's like thinking about the internet like it's helpful for taking newspapers online as the primary use case of the internet. Yeah, it's absolutely a use case that will be there for the internet, but probably not the most exciting thing because we're still figuring out exactly what this technology is, what it can do, and what things we want to build on top of it are. So I think that's the same. We're like kind of in that vein of crypto where we're like looking at the old world. We're saying, oh, there are all these pain points I have. Let's go figure out ways to use crypto to be able to make those better. And that absolutely is what we can do. But then there's like a whole host of emergent brand new behavior that we can see. And we're looking at and we're like, actually, we never thought it could be used for this, but actually it could make a lot of sense for this. And again, the internet, that may be the example of social networks, right? That maybe not something as obvious early on that was maybe the use case or one of the use cases of the internet. But over time, we realize that, and then people build on top of that. And that's maybe a call to action to this group is this is the role you have to play, right? I think what's really interesting about this is that there are very few experts in crypto. In theory, I'm an expert. I've been around for 8 years in crypto, but in a lot of ways, 8 years by most industry standards is very little, number one. And number two is that a lot of that knowledge is kind of anachronistic old knowledge for the first wave of cryptocurrencies. And all the new stuff that's going on has been around for 6 months or a year or 2 years. For example, NFT is a really great example of that. And so I personally think that like many of the folks in this room would have a tremendous amount of value to add there in a way that I couldn't, in a way that no one who's an expert on finance or no one who's an expert on even gaming would be able to add. I think over time where we're going to is basically we're gonna have millions of developers, and today, candidly, we have tens of thousands of developers, maybe. And so what we ultimately are gonna need, just like for web development, we had many people trained up, that's what we're gonna need. And so the role of any individual one of you can be tremendously powerful in this space. And I think ultimately where we're headed to is a world of billions of users, just like the internet. I think this is going to be wildly accessible. A whole host of people are going to be able to use it and interact with it. And we're going to have to make sure that we build safe, accessible, usable products for that whole group of people. And that's where I think really digging into the fact that I think it's really critical for us to get design thinking right. Not just the design, obviously, but beyond that is like, how does a user interact with it? How do they understand it? And how do we make that process easier of hiding away some of the complexity, but not hiding away the important complexity that actually should be revealed? For example, if a user is taking certain risks in the product they're using, how do we do that effectively? So I think I'll leave with maybe one last set of notes. It's just that I often get asked questions about entrepreneurship. How do you find yourself if you want to just create something in crypto? And I'll see in Q&A if there are more questions on entrepreneurship. So I'll go pretty quickly through this section. But I think often what I see in the teams are like a permutation of some type of like smart contract person, a backend person, and a hustler who's thinking about community management, or they're thinking about what the product value proposition is. Again, this is just like one set of archetypes. It could actually be an all-in-one person. I've sometimes seen that actually. And then other times I've seen this as like different people. You might have the backend hacker and the smart contract hacker be the same person, and you have someone else that they're paired with, who's thinking through the product and talking to users as part of it. But in Y Combinator, one of the core things that we talk about are there should be two things you do as a startup founder, and it's talk to users, and it's to build something. Like specifically, for a lot of software products, it's writing code. And so those are really the core things to really drive home, is that some type of sets of these muscles, and then letting you talk to users, and then let you also be able to like build the foundation that you need. There are different methods of funding. Happy to talk through this in later if it's helpful, but there's venture capital, there's going straight to tokens like an ICO, IEO, IDO, all different versions there. And a lot of people today are doing this idea of like a hybrid where they do VC first, raise money from venture capitalists, and then over time think about a way of tokens and reward people with that. Happy to talk through if there's any questions later of whether a DAO or not a DAO is helpful. And I also have a whole section on like user acquisition. And ways you can get your first 10 users, your first 100 users, and beyond that, and scale up beyond that. So I'll leave with one last thought, and then I want to leave it open because we have 15 more minutes to answer any questions you have. But I think what's really interesting is that I think at the height of the bull market in crypto, what I often get the question is that, am I too late? And I look at the state of where crypto is today, and it's still, I would call it like protean, or like, I think the term is, it's still really, really nascent. And so as a result, I think that's one interesting thing, is that people often think it's too late, that crypto's been around for a decade, this, that, the other. And I'm like, you look at the product experiences we have today, and there's so much better that we can do. There's so much complexity here. I think that's one. Two is the number of use cases that we've found are still a small number. Like, there's a few major things you can do with blockchains today. And I think that there's a lot more in the future that I can even predict, is going to come. I think that's another part, is that we're just getting started with that. And then I think when the markets turn and prices go down, or they're not going up as much as they used to, I think there's often this question of like, is it too late because crypto is a has-been, and there's the next thing to focus on. And I personally think is that this is the best time to get into this space, which is that a lot of the hype and noise goes away. There's a lot of focused time to be able to build really interesting things and try different things. And then likely there's a bull market or some type of, again, massive expansion in the space around the corner as well. And this is a really fantastic time to set the foundation for a product, to get user feedback, to be able to really nail something that you're building, and then to be able to go from there and start scaling it when the markets change as well. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And Mimi, we'll turn it over to you to see if there are any questions you have as well.
Thank you so much, Nemil. It was super informative. I mean, I myself have loads of questions, so I kept some of them for like I have the luxury, so I'll keep some of the questions that I will ask for myself. And I just wanted to, do you know what is POAP, proof of attendance protocol?
I don't know enough about proof of attendance protocol now.
So this is something that I use sometimes now at my talks online. It's kind of like a QR code that you can scan, and then whenever it's kind of uniquely generated code that whoever attended the event, they scan it, they can then get a free NFT as a proof of attendance. It's like, like Square, you could check into a place, and people just collecting these little POAPs. So I'm just gonna share a POAP for this session, because we do collect throughout all of this series. And I do have questions.
I'd be super excited to get one.
You should get one, totally. I can show you. Yeah, so this is the one for this session here. And yeah, I mean, I have, actually, this one is the laser one, but yeah, I did for the other university a POAP that actually was the generative art. I was just playing around and see like, how is it to code gen art? Is it that complicated? And it's just quite fun. So yeah, so actually the question that I have here are quite technical. So I'll just ask maybe a broader one that I had from one of my students yesterday. They asked me about a placement, an internship that they considering to take over the next term. So they were like, should I go to like a big design consultancy? So let's say IDEO or something like that. Or she's very interested into Web3, or should I go to like, I found like a small company that is starting building in the Web3 space, and it's just like 5 of them. And is it like too risky of a career move? Because, we don't know what will happen in a few weeks or in a few months with the small startups, and especially in the space. Or, as a young, graduate, what would be kind of your advice?
It's a great question, Mimi, and I get this question a lot from folks on my team and folks in the industry. First, I'll just want to say is there's no one size fits all answer. I think the big things I just reflect on is that I think generally the cost of messing up early in your career is very low. People will be really understanding of different things that you've done. And so I think that's just like one observation, is that generally that biases me towards taking a little bit more risk early on, especially if it's in the direction of where you want to go. Not just taking risk for risk's sake, or because you feel you have to do a startup, but because you're like, hey, this is really cool, and I have some intuition for why I think this is interesting. So I think that's like maybe one big part of it. The other thing is I often think, especially early in your career, there's value to finding a mentor. And that's where I think that there's a question in my mind of like, I think there's obviously like the IDEOs and other design consultancies have amazing mentors and really amazing programs to be able to help you learn. And also all of them actually often have an interest in blockchain. I think a lot of design consultancies have done that. But often what I look for at the smaller stage startups is that that's the right opportunity. See if there's someone there who can also mentor you and help you grow and is going to be willing to do that as well. The biggest worry I have is like a very tiny portion startup. If you're there just to learn, rather than like you actually believe deeply in the mission and you want to, you think that startup is the next big thing, is that my only worry is that a lot of the focus on execution. And so you may not get as much learning as that. There might not be someone to teach you. And so often like what I love is like a mid-stage startup, like something like 20 people and up often, because then there's more time for great folks to already be there to provide you that guidance and input. And then the other things the analogy I often use for work, for picking like any career is often like there's this thing like SAC I use. It's like, so you can laugh a little bit, but it's basically skills, accomplishments, context, and knowledge. There's like the 4 things you look for in different careers. And I think that I would put it through that lens. And so for example, what I find is like, if it's slightly larger, you have more contacts available, you're starting to build up your network as well. If it's too small, that can be a little more detrimental. But I think the way I'd often do it is be like a mid-sized startup, and then potentially like consulting or supporting other startups in the space that are smaller. And if you find you're really passionate about their mission, then over time decide that that's the right investment to make.
Yeah, so yeah, for me, I would just say like aim at Series B or something, because they kind of got the next
I think it's a really
funding.
great side to be.
It's not risky, and then you will observe the scaling up, and then after that you can basically, you're in a big company with like a good brand, and you can move easily. But yeah, I think it's now the kind of the tide is shifting. So it kind of, back then, of course, we all would suggest going to like massive organizations to have a big name. I mean, in your case, you had Google in your CV, so you had already like a massive name behind.
Well, I was at a startup that was acquired by Google, and I wasn't there when it was acquired by Google. So again, this is the history of like LinkedIn and how that works. But what I'd say is that I thought the startup was doing really interesting stuff. It was a 30% startup when I joined, and I think at 250 employees, I think it sold to Google. For me, there was like good signal, and for me, it was alumni in my school were already there. We're already having something amazing that was working. And so again, same thing is that as I think of Imperial College, maybe there's like alumni where you see something working, and then that's a really exciting time to join, because I saw that scale up from 25 people to 250 people, and that was a really exciting journey.
Yeah, thank you. So back to these technical questions. Okay, I don't know if you can answer this one. Well, because you mentioned it in the presentation, when will Ethereum 2.0 be ready?
So about the same as most people in the community. And so what I'd say is that my sense is sometime later this year will be the merge. I think Vitalik in his latest talk just a few days ago mentioned something around like August if things went the right way, and that would be specifically the merge. And then withdrawals and the launch of the whole larger network would come after that. But my general sense is in the course of the next 6 months that we're going to be thinking about the merge, probably earlier than the next 6 months. And then after that, we'll probably think sometime next year about the withdrawals and allowing people to stake and unstake, et cetera.
Okay, and then, so this is again kind of like a similar type question. Do you think the volatility of crypto are so tied to Bitcoin's highs and lows, or is it more a generally wider consensus factoring other crypto? How or even why would volatility be challenged?
So I didn't understand the volatility part, but if I take a step back, is that when I started in the space, Bitcoin was it, right? So there's the price of Bitcoin. It was not, I don't know if it was widely correlated to other markets that were out there at the time. And what's really changed in the space is that you have a tremendous amount of cryptocurrencies. And I think you have a tremendous amount of correlation now to the traditional markets. So for example, when you have a lot of tech stocks go up in value a ton as a result, a ton of crypto was going up a ton. And at least the data seems to show that like they're much more correlated today. So when those tech stocks or NASDAQ or the FTSE or others like drop a lot, the price of crypto dropped as well. I think this is not financial advice, but I think what's interesting to me is that you have now different pockets of the space. And I think that over time, these are going to perform somewhat differently. And so, for example, I could see a world where NFTs, the usage of that is very different than the usage of Bitcoin, for example. They're really different value propositions, really different products. And so I think that over time, what I see is like similar to the stock market, where even though the stock market, let's say, has been down in the last several weeks, it doesn't mean that every stock is down. There are things that are doing different things and they're doing great. And so I expect to see more and more decoupling, but candidly today, it's highly correlated, all of them together, and it's highly correlated to the stock market, is at least what the data shows. Again, none of this is like, I'm not a financial analyst, but just like if you like, look at the data, that's my sense is like what you're seeing. But I think over time, you're gonna start some dislocation of that. And I would expect over the next decade that that might change pretty substantially.
Yeah, I agree. So potentially right now it's still like dependent on the market sentiment. Like, if the market's going up, everything's going up. But the example that, we could see like the normal market, like when COVID happened, like the airplane shares just went down and they were just like completely separated by, I don't know, Peloton shares at that time. So we could like track different trends. And then this is the question that I think it's quite combined to my last question I wanted to ask you. So when do you think Web3 will be adopted by the masses? And I think I wanted to just add to this question, what are the use cases that you're most excited about to see?
Yeah, and I alluded to some of that. I think, so first question, adopted by the masses. I really think it's like starting to get widely adopted. And what I mean by that is, for example, Coinbase, we announced like a dApp browser in our main app. And so suddenly it means for tens of millions of users, they have access to all of the dApps that are out there in the ecosystem, right? So on one hand, what I'll say is compared to where we were, which is that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people used or knew about crypto, we've come a tremendous way, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if in the world, 100 million plus have interacted in some deeper form of crypto, not just buy and hold an asset. Like my sense is that there is probably many millions of users out there who've done some other form of that. So on one side, I just want to say is we've come a long way. Flip side is that still, if I compare this to the example of the internet or the mobile phone, foundational like technology experiences, still a fraction of the way that we're there. And personally, I can't predict. And this is why, like, what I say, I use the billions and millions because I'm like, I don't know the time frame. I think over the next decade for sure is my feeling, right? But like think about like, if someone had to predict 10 years ago today, there's so many things that they would have gotten wrong. And so I think the thing I'll say there is, maybe where I throw it back on the students is that it's really interesting is like, what role can you play in getting it faster to a wider range of people, right? And so things I think about often is that we talk often in Coinbase of this idea of jobs to be done. What are things that need to be fixed in the space? And so some of the ones that come to mind for me are usability, taking all the complexity, like for example, the POAP, I'm sure that experience can be significantly easier than it might be today. And there's the gas fees, there's the transaction time, there's the fact you need to know what a wallet is and what it does, all this other stuff. Same way as that, like I'll give you an example on the computer. We invented the mouse. We invented GUIs and like Windows. All this stuff was actually not stuff that was there in the first version of the computer. It's just literally text and a keyboard, right? And even the keyboard was an invention from I think 100 to 150 years ago from the typewriter, right? So all these were usability innovations that we created, and that's where I think if I turn to the students, I'm like, what are things you can do and gaps you're seeing? Because I don't think they're rocket science, but I think one of the things I think is really interesting of specifically this class is that a lot of people in early crypto are deep, like back-end software engineers, like and very deep in that. But often that means they're not as good at thinking about the usability for end users, right? And that's where I think this class is a really great example, and this school is a great example of the shifts of thinking we need to be able to get to the next wave. And so I think the short answer is I don't know when we'll get there. I think over the next decade, but I do think that there's things that we need to go solve. And I think like the biggest ones for me are usability and trust are probably two big ones. Those are key areas that Coinbase invests in. But I think those are probably critical ones. And I think many students here are well placed to support that.
Yeah, I am quite excited about two use cases. The first one is the POAP for education, because I have classes with like a sheet of paper of students marking their attendance, and of course you have more names on the sheet of paper than actually people in the classroom. So by just scanning these POAPs, I can know exactly how many people. You can rely with that because it's just per device the code regenerates. So I'm just like, this is kind of like a fun use of blockchain technology to just not cheat on your presence in the classroom. And the other one that I'm observing, because I'm also involved in a fashion college, it's digital fashion and how in the future we can maybe even consume less and consume less physically, and then buy more digital fashion just through using the technology. I'm quite excited for that.
And I spoke about gaming before, but to me, gaming is a virtual world where you have digital goods, and the power of crypto is it lets you create scarce digital goods. And so I think there's a huge role of like fashion meets these digital worlds that we're living in. It could be a metaverse, or it could just be, a game that we play.
Yeah. Or on Zoom. Hopefully one day I'll be able to wear a new funky thing on Zoom. Cool. We're close to this. This is a good one. What is the most exciting thing going on under the covers at Coinbase? Any secrets that can be revealed for the rest of the year and beyond?
Things that are going on below the surface that we haven't announced yet. The things I would say that are, I'll give you one example of something that's exciting to me. I alluded to this earlier, is that we just announced this DApp browser. And so if you've used like MetaMask or Coinbase Wallet in the past, what we've done is taken that experience and put it directly into our mobile app. And so what I get really excited about is if you're a DApp developer out there, you created an NFT product, you've created some type of decentralized finance app. The hardest thing for users is that, for those developers, is that how do I get users on my platform? There's only a few million people or tens of million people who know MetaMask, who can understand the complexities of that to be able to use something like this. And most of the world doesn't use it, right? Mm-hmm. That's maybe the biggest challenge. So what I get excited about is like, that's one product where I'm so excited that we've launched that and we're going to grow that over time. But I think that that's going to really open up people's ability to access dApps. Mm-hmm. And then I think for developers, they're going to try new and different things. It's going to lead to a lot of innovation, similar to the App Store, let's say, or it's similar to like the websites, like people trying different things, putting it out there, people accessing it. So that's probably the one that gets me the most excited recently, and that's one we publicly announced. So I can also share that.
Okay, sorry for that. I have another question, but I think I know that I will keep you a bit longer. I agree with the dApps. I mean, it's quite interesting to see because I'm going to look into that myself. Final question, what's your favorite thing about working at Coinbase? And in a few words, how would you summarize your close to 4 years there? Half a decade, almost.
So probably the biggest thing is the impact you can have. So there are lots of exciting places to work in crypto, right? So I want to just one is just get you all excited about crypto in general. But the thing I love about Coinbase has been that we make a change and it can change the entire industry, often for the better. And so like USDC is an example where worked on stable coins, thought there was value to a dollar-based one, but trust had to be really baked into it and at the core of it. That's the type of thing that we get to work on. And that was amazing because it feels like we're providing some really deeply needed product. And when we launch it, there are many millions of users who can have access to it quickly, and it can help grow the entire space. So that's probably the biggest thing for me is impact at scale, is what I'd say. And two is that there's this often perspective that like you learn in college and then you go into the real world and you do, right? Like that's maybe like some type of analogy that I think I've often heard expressed. And what I find really
interesting. You have a mortgage.
Yeah, you have a mortgage, you have a life, you have all those other things. And I think what's interesting has been, this has been the craziest graduate degree of my life at Coinbase, because we basically grew from, I think, a few hundred people to thousands of people in the course of 3.5 years. And the entire space grew, right? Like this was kind of a backwater, I think up to 2016, 17 really exploded, but then it went into a winter again, right? And I think for a while, people weren't sure where this was going to go. So I think that was maybe the reflection, is that I don't think you can pay for an education like this, which is that how do you help build a company, help grow a company, and how do you make all these decisions that have to be made on a regular basis in crypto, where everything's changing all the time. And I think that's maybe one other lesson if you're thinking getting into crypto, is there are all these industries and professions that have been around for a long time. They're much more stable. Things are not changing. But I wake up every day and I'm like, someone's going to invent something that's like literally tomorrow the entire space is going to change totally. And there's very few spaces you can say that. Again, I think a lot of technology spaces in the early years that happens, right? In the earliest years of like the internet or the PC, get up one morning and someone invented the mouse. And you get up another morning, someone invented the Windows, or they invented the browser, right? These are all things that came about. I think the same thing is where we are in crypto.
Yeah, it's actually, I wanted to ask that before, like you survived the winter because you joined in January 2017, kind of the DeFi space. And the year after, just everything just went down, and you kind of stayed there, survived, and then you were through like the IPO of Coinbase. I think that must be so exciting. And then, yeah, just closing that, I think the word you said, having an impact, I just realized you guys have as many users as the population of Vietnam. I'm from Vietnam, so I'm like, wow, it's like literally my whole country. So congratulations on that. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for this amazing talk. Hope we'll have some different opportunity to bring you back to the school whenever you're in London. To ping me. I'd love to show you around the campus. And yeah, maybe one day you can see and come see the students in person.
I would love that. And so I often come to London. So just want to say I have family there. So that's one thing. The other thing is you can follow me on Twitter, NEMILD, but specifically we do have internships and we do have roles, open over time. So if you don't hesitate to DM me if there's any ways that I can support.
So I actually had a student who did a whole, module essay on Coinbase. So I'll link you to him. Maybe he's quite obsessed with Coinbase. Great. Thank you so much, Nemil. Have a great
Thank you so much, Mimi.
day. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, students.
Bye.
Bye.